Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar, EU Democracy Promotion in Turbulent Times, a Critical Reflection. Across the European neighbourhood, from North Africa to the Balkans and the Caucasus, citizens have mobilized for freedom and democracy. Yet their trajectories have differed greatly, and the role of the EU in supporting democratization from below has also been highly uneven and shaped by a challenging political environment. My name is Véronique Dudoué. I'm a senior advisor at the Barker Foundation, and I am delighted to open this webinar on behalf of the Embrace project. This event will be moderated by Professor Sonia Grimm, who has co-coordinated this international project together with me the past 3 years. Sonia is Professor of International Relations and European Studies at the Julius Maximilian University in Würzburg in Germany. And as scientific lead of Embrace, she will briefly introduce the work we have carried out together, and she will then introduce our distinguished panelists and guide us through the discussion. So Sonia, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Vero, for the introduction and welcoming our guests to this webinar. I also warmly welcome you to this webinar of Embrace, a Horizon Europe funded research consortium. Embrace has studied the obstacles to democratization and democracy support in the European neighborhood over the last 2 decades. We record this webinar at Wednesday, 17 September 2025 at 1:30 p.m. Berlin time, virtually hosted at Berghoff Foundation Berlin. Embrace is a consortium of 14 partner institutions. It's started its research work in October 22 and will finish at the end of this month, September 25. Embrace has investigated the obstacles to democratization and democracy support within 23 countries located in the European neighborhood in a quantitative approach, and in 12 countries in a qualitative approach with in-depth interviews and observation. We focused on obstacles to democratization at 3 levels. That is the level of the countries, the level of the European Union, and the international or geopolitical level. We studied the interplay of these obstacles and their impact on political trajectories in 5 subregions of the neighborhood, that is, Eastern Europe, Southern Caucasus, Western Balkans, Middle East, and Northern Africa. In this webinar, we want to place specific emphasis on one of the themes investigated in Embrace, namely how bottom-up popular struggles for political change, EU engagement, and broader geopolitical shifts interact to shape political trajectories in the European neighborhood. And what are the implications of these dynamics for both the EU and the region's citizens mobilizing for more inclusive and resilient societies? It is a great pleasure for me to host this webinar today, and I'm even more pleased to have 4 distinguished colleagues together with me in this webinar, representing 4 different partner institutions out of 14 Embrace partners, and bringing in expertise from 4 of the 5 subregions of the neighborhood that we have studied in Embrace. Professor David Abrastice is a professor of political science at Elias State University in Tbilisi, Georgia. He received his PhD from Hamburg University, Germany, and was a Fulbright scholar at Duke University, North Carolina, United States. In addition to his academic work, he has been actively involved in programs supporting civil society in Georgia. David overviewed developments in the Southern Caucasus within Embrace. A warm welcome to you, David. Professor Marko Šilović is an assistant professor of Serbian and comparative politics at the University of Belgrade, Serbia. He received his PhD from George Washington University, where his dissertation examined the origins and consequences of the illiberal turn in center-right politics in post-communist Europe. Marco focused on the Western Balkans in Embrace and particularly on Serbia. Thank you very much for being with us today, Marco. Ms. Lara Azam is a senior project manager at the Berghoff Foundation's MENA office in Lebanon. She joined the Berghoff Foundation in 2015, where she has worked on several dialogue projects, for instance, on addressing violent extremism, inclusive political and social reforms, and most recently leading the China MENA project. Within Embrace, she conducted research on democratization and popular uprising in Lebanon. Welcome, Lara. And last but not least, Dr. Sarah Rennick. Sarah is the Deputy Director for Research at the Arab Reform Initiative and a lecturer in international relations and comparative politics at the American Graduate School in Paris. At the Arab Reform Initiative, she is head of the program on inclusive politics and is currently conducting research on policy advisory systems and the nexus between knowledge production and citizen participation in policymaking. Within Embrace, she led Work Package 4, investigating the drivers and obstacles to achieve small-scale political gains after popular uprisings. In this webinar, we will inform you about the results of Embrace, having prepared 4 main topics that we will present to you. While listening, please feel free to put your questions into the webinar chat. Please indicate the name of the expert who should respond to your question. We seek to come to your questions at the end of this webinar. We focus in this webinar on episodes of contentious politics over the last 2 decades, starting around 2000, in the entire neighborhood from the east to the south. 7 research teams collected information in 9 countries over 24 episodes, if I remember correctly, for Work Package 4. Sarah, as the Work Package leader, can you briefly explain to our audience the design of the study within Work Package 4?
Yes, of course. It's my pleasure. So our point of departure for the research, it was really the puzzle we were investigating, was the continuation of protests and social movement action and contentious politics in the aftermath of popular uprisings or revolutions. And more precisely, we wanted to investigate why, regardless of the outcome of the popular uprising or the revolutionary movement, why some social movement actors who continue their mobilization even after the episode of mass protest ends, why some are able to gain traction and successfully push through the types of changes they're seeking in terms of policies or legislation or practices, while others are blocked. And so our theoretical point of departure was that the mass uprisings themselves create new windows of opportunity for social movement actors that extend even after the moment of popular mobilization ends. What we were theorizing is that popular uprisings reconfigure political relations, political structures, and social relations at the macro and micro levels, and that these can be, in some cases, beneficial for social movement actors who are able to take advantage of these windows of opportunity and these new configurations, but also at the same time detrimental for others. And so we wanted to investigate these reconfigurations in order to understand outcomes of social movement action. So our research design considered, as Sonia stated, about 24 episodes of social movement mobilization in the immediate aftermath of popular uprisings in 9 different countries. And for each country, we considered at least 1 episode where social movement actors were successful, where they were able to achieve the kind of gains they were seeking, and one where they were blocked. And we were then studying these configurations. in a second moment, we then looked at how external actors, and including the European Union, interacted with these configurations so that we could see how external support and things like European democracy promotion can actually contribute or block social movement actors. And so our empirical evidence was derived from a lot of different sources. We used archival materials. We conducted semi-structured interviews with social movement actors in all countries. We looked into official discourses and other forms of protest materials, including iconography. And each episode was systematically investigated to ensure comparability across all the cases. And then we conducted case-oriented comparative analysis so we could arrive at thick understanding and generalizations across all episodes.
So the approach within Work Package 4 was really ambitious in light of the fact that you compared episodes from Tiflis to Tunis, from Belgrade to Beirut, so overviewing the entire neighborhood from the east to the south. And to repeat, you seeked to investigate the small-scale political gains that these episodes of contentious politics seek to incite. For example, social rights improvements, independence of judiciary, or anti-corruption measures. Obviously, the path that these different episodes followed cannot be the same. Based on your research, what were the biggest challenges that determined whether these episodes of contentious politics could bring meaningful change in your region? David, what did you find for the Southern Caucasus?
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you, Sarah, dear colleagues. It's nice to see you. Our research, in particular, the Georgian episode, is focused on an event that took place actually 20 years ago. That was the regime change, peaceful transfer of power in Georgia back in 2003, often labeled as a Rose Revolution. Although more than 2 decades have passed, revisiting and reassessing this event provided valuable insights for the conditions under which bottom-up actors can contribute to this meaningful political change. And this reassessment, I think, it's still valid considering the current situation of current trend of democracy backsliding, what is happening, unfortunately, in Georgia, and not only. Well, if we look at details at the episode in more details, we found that local civil society actors were indeed able to play an important role in the moments of these political reconfigurations. I will not go on details and describe all the mechanisms and all the let's say tactics used by these actors that you can find also in our publications, which will be available to the public very soon. What I want to underline is that we could trace down 3 different types of functions or different, let's say, contributions of civil society. First, before this uprising, before this opening, let's say, started, in this period, civil society was instrumental to raise public awareness and, first of all, connect the social economic grievances to political demands. We were investigating the case of anti-corruption, and we could see that civil society was a very important key player, not only presenting the corruption as something morally wrong, but also to connect it to political or social economic situation. So, in other words, transforming this grievance into political demands. During the mobilization phase or this stage of reconfiguration, civil society was able to forge alliances with political actors, observe, in our case, the national elections, which coincided with this period of transition, and after the elections, also helped to organize protests. The main finding for us, nevertheless, was how the civil society was able to contribute to this post-Sarah named it in the aftermath of the political reconfiguration. In our case, beyond what we know from the academic literature, beyond agenda setting and beyond monitoring the process of reforms, we found out that many former leaders of civil society joined the ranks of the political, let's say, government, the new government, and also the public administration, where they were able to implement their visions and their agendas. As one of the interviewees told us, quite to the point, I guess, the most effective path of transferring these ideas to the new political decision-making apparatus was that the ideas followed individuals. So these new individuals could implement these reforms from within. Yet, of course, this development came at a cost because it weakened the civil society on the other hand, and it led to a different type of challenges, a new cycle of democratic, let's say, backsliding. But I think this is another story to tell, and I will stop here.
Yeah, thank you very much, David, for these insights from Georgia particularly. Marco, raising public awareness, creating alliances with political actors and civil society leaders joining the government. Did you observe similar mechanisms in the Western Balkans, in Serbia particularly?
Yes, indeed. So I think at that level, sort of the mechanisms of change, we have indeed seen a lot of similarities. And another similarity with the Georgian case in particular is that in Serbia and the Western Balkans, we'll sort of look at the longer history of these processes because Serbia had its democratic revolution even earlier in 2000, so 25 years ago. And I think looking at the events that happen, all of these are becoming historical events, has its advantages and disadvantages. And the advantage of it is that we know sort of the long arc of that story. So what followed the democratic revolution in 2000 was a decade of broadly democratic politics. And unfortunately, since 2012, the regime, with the return of the former regime parties that were sort of superficially reformed, the country has been sliding back into sort of competitive authoritarianism. And I guess what most people will have seen in the news lately, with the new uprising, I guess the government right now that the authoritarian regime is thoroughly delegitimized and sort of holding on to the power through use of increasingly shameless and brutal repression. And I think what that tells us about what we care about is that the small scale gains, what we focused in the research, is descent into authoritarianism over the last decade or so, wiped out, rendered meaningless a lot of these small scale gains, even though often they stayed in the letter of law. They were sort of constantly infringed upon in practice as the country lost the democratic its democratic government, democratic regime. So let me give you an example. So in the one of the episodes that we researched, it was actually the episode where the small scale gains were achieved was actually the expansion of the minority rights that was provoked by the mobilization of actually Albanian minority in the three municipalities of Serbia bordering Kosovo. This mobilization resulted in expansion of ethnic minority rights, not only for Albanians, but for the change of the general regime of ethnic minority rights in the country. But then this Vučić regime, because it could not co-opt political leaders of Albanians in Serbia, what it does, it sort of tramples on those rights, and especially uses various ways, for instance, to administratively erase Albanians their addresses from those municipalities, thus rendering their political clout smaller, creating all sorts of everyday obstacles to the people who cannot procure documents and so on. So we have the rights in the paper that were achieved after this revolution in 2000, but the competitive authoritarianism sort of renders them largely meaningless. So I think my conclusion, sort of big picture conclusion, is that for these small scale changes to have meaningful long-term effect, this conflict that followed the revolution, be it about ethnic right, about socioeconomic rights, should not escalate, should not be undermined this large gain of the consensus that the society has achieved about democratic rules of the game. Because if you lose that big, large gain of democracy, then these small changes are very, very vulnerable as well.
Yeah, thank you, Marco, for these insights. We are ambitious in a way in Embrace as we are comparing episodes from Eastern Europe with episodes from the Southern neighborhood, while we are knowing that context, political situations, political trajectories are substantially different. Nevertheless, Lara, I dare to bring you in now. What are your insights in comparison, maybe also to what David and Marco said?
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you, colleagues. Actually, despite the different context, a lot of the dynamics around the small scale gains are very similar. So, for example, in Lebanon, the case study that we took in the context of this work package, we looked at the 2019 uprising that took place across Lebanon. It was the first of its kind that was cross-confessional, cross-sectorial, and although the results were not the results of the uprising were not what the protesters or what the people really hoped for, so they did not achieve a real political change of the political system or meaningful reforms. They did, however, lead to changes that have an accumulative nature. So, for instance, one of the main findings is that some of the success of these of the campaigns done by civil society was a good momentum. The uprising was a good momentum, but really one of the major factors is also the years and years of lobbying before the uprising, and the although it didn't seem like the lobbying years was going to lead somewhere, that momentum of the uprising plus the financial crisis that hit Lebanon that delegitimized a lot of the politicians was a good chance to actually implement some reforms nonetheless that are not let's say extremely political. So, for instance, one of the episodes that we looked at is the cancellation of building a dam that was supposed to be funded by the World Bank and the EU and the UN. And this dam was seen by environmentalists and activists as ecologically not really beneficial, and that it will hurt the environment. But politicians and also the international community decided to go forward with it before the uprising because of their alliances with the political elites, because of agreed upon basically arrangements with the political elite. When the momentum came of the uprising, and it became more politically correct to actually distance yourself from the political elite, and thus the cancellation of the dam happened, and then the rhetoric changed. The rhetoric of the Lebanese political elites, but also the international community changed in a way that started advocating for what the protesters were advocating for. So they adopted it. The environmental cause became a political cause, and so this was the main gain. The other episode I looked at is the independence of the judiciary, which is it's been on the table by Lebanese reformists and also international communities since 2011. And although the uprising did not lead to really to implement that, just early this year the law was approved. And again, this is an accumulation of raising awareness before the 2020 uprising, of course, a result of all the crises that hit Lebanon, the political crisis since 2019 until now, but also because of the reformist government that exists today, for which the reformist civil society ambiance or the people behind it actually advocated for, lobbied for it, and made the ideas ready for when political change happens or some security change happens, these ideas will come forward. So again, it's accumulative.
Hmm. So a specific constellation of structural factors and political uprising, civil society engagement can create a momentum for political change. That I think is clearly understood. Sarah, do you agree with that for Northern Africa, the countries that you investigated?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting when we look at, so in our work package, we compared Algeria and Tunisia. What's interesting about these is that they actually had quite different trajectories in the post-uprising period. So Tunisia had its mass popular movement in 2011, which actually produced a very veritable democratic transition process. Vast institutional reform, change in political elites, a new constitution. It really was a democratization process. Algeria had its mass uprising in 2019. And what ended up happening was that while there was a certain degree of political transition, it really was sort of a reconstitution of the same structures of power with a different facade. But when we compare the episodes between this, we see that the same kinds of challenges existed and the same kinds of factors can explain success of social movement actors, despite the fact that the contextual pathways were different following the uprising. In both Algeria and Tunisia, when we looked at episodes of blockage on the part of social movement actors, we saw that the authorities were able to neutralize the demands of social movement actors and were able to break up the social movements in processes when they were able to use piecemeal concessions, when they were able to provide a certain degree of personalized concessions to the protesters. This was able to break up their collective action and actually neutralize them. And in both cases, the case in Algeria we looked at was with the magistrates who were mobilizing for the independence of the judiciary, and in Tunisia with the Union of Unemployed Graduates, who were mobilizing both for their own cause in order to have some form of economic and social inclusion, but also for much more radical economic reform in Tunisia. And in both cases, the authorities were able to offer these piecemeal concessions to the protesters, to these movements, these very local, highly unified movements in the sense that they all share socio-professional location. And they were able to offer concessions to them that met certain demands, and this had this neutralizing effect. And we also saw that where success occurred was when the coalitions were not just unique to a certain socio-professional location, but actually extended across different groups. And in those cases, it was much harder to use these kinds of concessions, these kinds of divide and rule tactics in order to neutralize the protests. And they were able to sustain protest far longer and make broader demands because of thanks to these broad coalitions.
Hmm. Yeah, thank you, Sarah, for explaining this to us. So on the one hand side, we have, let's say on the positive side, the opportunity of civil society actors to trigger political change. But on the other hand side, we also see how political actors very successfully, as Sarah put it, neutralize these demands. And as David put it, even backsliding on the political trajectory could be observed. Let's have a look on the very important external actor in this game here, the European Union. The European Union often presents itself as a supporter of democracy, so it should be naturally a supporter of these political competition or of civil society actors as well. But the local perception on the EU's involvements are very mixed at the moment. Scholarly critics highlight double standards, for the example that the EU would prioritize security, good economic relations, and migration control over democracy support. And a lot of criticism also circles around the inconsistent policies towards countries in war situations. So let's have a look on what you find. What did when did the European Union supports makes a meaningful difference, and when did the European Union support fall short or even backfire? Sarah, what would you say?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to start by saying that perhaps one of the biggest findings across not just the North African cases, but the entire work package, so all 9 countries and all episodes, is that the European Union's support to democracy promotion, its various tools of democracy promotion, is best able to assist bottom-up actors to achieve these small-scale democratic gains when such gains are seen as contributing to the stabilization of the new democratic regime. And so I think this is really the key point, is that the EU is not, the tools are not really designed to help in the moment of the mass uprising itself. And they're not necessarily designed to really support these grassroots bottom-up actors themselves. So what happens is during these moments of mass uprising, which are by definition extremely contingent, highly ambiguous, we don't really know where the cards are going to fall. The EU's approach was very much sort of a sit back and wait and see what was going to happen. Once those pathways were put into place, this is when the EU support kind of kicks in. And when there was a process of democratization going into place, in the case of Tunisia, for example, we actually were able to see how the EU support was able to concretely help those bottom-up actors. And there's 2 ways in particular I'll cite here in the case of Tunisia. The first was in promoting what we called alignment between different actors. So within these broad coalitions I was speaking about, one of the things the EU did was create different spaces and different opportunities for exchange between different actors about the issue that they were interested in. So in the case of, for example, the feminist mobilization in Tunisia post-2011 with regards to the constitution and the wording that would be put into the constitution regarding women's rights and women's equality. The EU created, opportunities for training, opportunities for exchange, opportunities, really creating these venues where different actors that cared about this issue were coming together and discussing it. And this created a certain degree of alignment about how they were thinking about the issue, what the nature of the demands were, and what they would actually be pushing for very concretely. And that alignment, which extended across these different coalitions, and not just with bottom-up actors, but also with certain policymakers, certain people in a position to influence decisions, was crucial in creating the necessary impetus, the necessary consensus around it that could kind of push forward for those democratic gains to be made. The other way that the EU was useful, and not just the EU, I should say, external actors in general, is within these broad coalitions, in order to sustain this kind of mobilization, this kind of consensus, these efforts, whether they're, protests on the street, lobbying efforts, advocacy efforts, communications campaigns, that requires human resources, that requires time. And this is where external support was very beneficial. When external support was directed for organizations, for core human resources within organizations. So within the transitional justice movement in Tunisia, there was a coordinator that had salary was provided. And that is a key position that allows for the kind of coordinations that's necessary to sustain the mobilization, to sustain the pressure campaign. So it's not project-based support. It's not, top-down support to governments and to institutions. It's actually the kind of support that bottom-up actors need in order to do their work. And that was a really essential thing that different external actors were able to provide. In terms of the flip side of the coin is that the European Union has been, when we think about democratic backsliding and this primacy of stability, has had a large difficulty in course correcting. So in the case of Tunisia, we have seen this very deliberate process of dismantling the democratic institutions, dismantling the democratic transition. And the EU has had an inability or an unwillingness to course correct for that. So the same kinds of support mechanisms that were stabilizing the democratic regime, the democratic transition, are now being used, and they're stabilizing the new status quo, which of course is leading to, contributing to the maintenance of the new regime and the restoration of this authoritarianism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much, Sarah. Lara, would you agree with what Sarah said?
Yes, absolutely. So in the words of some of the EU diplomats or officials that we interviewed, they say that the EU is risk averse and that it's not a change-making entity. And so with these 2 statements, I think this summarizes the the perceived, at least, approach of the EU in Lebanon, which is that the EU is mostly interested in stabilization. And by stabilization, we mean preventing the flow of refugees, anti-terrorism, and things like that, which do not always intersect with what is in the national interest of Lebanon. So with that being said, most of activists and civil society organizations still need and call for more EU support. So with nuances, of course. EU support since 2011 to Lebanon. First, EU is the biggest donor. The EU support is about $3.5 billion since 2011 to Lebanon. And we're talking between 2011 and 2019, this assistance was coming without, despite knowing and despite the EU and other donors acknowledging the systematic and structural corruption, the lack of transparent procurement processes, the lack of real democratic processes. So I think where the EU has or could have done better is for some people is just sticking to the real democratic values that they promote, and not really compromising them for the sake of stability, and making alliances with the political elite that are corrupt, that have caused basically deaths in the port explosion because of basically just perhaps political reasons, but also just negligence, and that. So it's really about sticking to those values. In addition, one of the remarked assistance by the EU was after the protests and after the financial crisis, a lot of the EU funding for a short time got channeled instead of to the government, more to civil society organizations. And so this was appreciated because then it didn't pass through the usual channels and it didn't get embezzled, and so this was good for a while. But then, but this was only short-lived. Then it got back to the usual channels, and there's a need for more monitoring mechanisms in place, and also of being more inclusive, for the EU being more inclusive. For instance, the EU, one of also the good thing that the EU did in terms of democratic inclusion is after the port explosion and the financial crisis, and through the 3RF mechanism, which is the EU's support mechanism to Lebanon, they created these consultative forums whereby they brought civil society and experts not from the political elites to consult with them on the reforms or what is needed, etc. And this was seen as a good step, as a rare step. Nevertheless, a lot of those people who attended those the discussions say that these platforms were also a bit elite oriented. So they were elitist. They created elite reformists. The usual suspects of people who go on TV, and they did not include, for instance, people from areas outside Lebanon. What else? So yeah, so although it's very much needed, and they would still advocate for it, there are plenty of recommendations for the EU where the money can be used in a better and more meaningful way.
Yeah, we will briefly summarize our recommendations also in this webinar. But before doing so, I would like to ask Marco, following up on what Lara said. So it seemed that in the cases that Lara studied, the EU did not do well to stick to its real democratic values, but it stick to security and economic issues. Marco, Serbia was somehow in the early 2000s a poster case for democratization. What was there back then, the EU's behavior? Would you agree with Lara said, or was it somehow different back then?
Right, but I think the effectiveness from our research, the effectiveness of EU intervention depends a lot on whether these goals of promoting democracy and security and sometimes economic interests, whether they are aligned or competing. I think what enabled Serbia to be relatively successful in the early 2000s, in many examples, such as the example of sort of EU helping rechannel armed rebellion in southern Serbia into democratic processes, the interests for security, stability, and democracy coincided, and that made EU very effective. And then there are some more recent examples where these priorities compete, and then it's a challenge for the EU to find a balance between them. And I think what comes out from our research here is that prioritizing the stability or sort of geoeconomic interests it's not risk-free. It comes with its own risk, prioritizing them over democracy. I think a really good recent example is this project of lithium mining in Western Serbia. The regime sort of lashed on that project because it was supposed to be a big investment. It was supposed to showcase development and so on. But because there are public is very has become over the years very suspicious about everything that the regime does. That's so the regime sponsoring of the project and the lithium mining project sort of tainted the project as a whole and made it the target of a bottom-up mobilization to oppose the mining. And to see why, even though I think a lot of the sort of concerns about the mine are not necessarily founded or justified, the skepticism is huge because the public sees how the regime implements project. You just need to look at this train station in Novi Sad, which unfortunately in November 1st last year collapsed after recently being renovated by the regime in front of the cameras, and it killed 16 commuters. So their involvement in this project sort of raises a lot of fear, a lot of concerns, and instead of sort of the EU basically all but ignored those concerns and sort of doubled down on working in a very top-down manner with the regime, for instance, by signing the strategic partnership in supply of critical resources. And so ignoring the opposition from the civil society actors, grassroots mobilization of the locals, ignoring the non-transparent or not harmful way in which the Serbian regime actually implements those projects, and even ignoring the repressive response of the regime to the mobilization against the mine. And what are the results of this? What do we see now a few years later? Well, I think it's becoming increasingly clear that this mine is not going to happen because this whole politicization, which EU never sort of contributed, never contributed to depoliticizing this project, preventing the regime from capturing the narrative, it made the project toxic. And now the regime is too weak to force through the project. And I'm afraid that any future democratic government will not be able or even willing to detoxify this project because it became so much entangled with the authoritarian politics. Sometimes it may seem that the hard-nosed realism and we need the resources and we need stability over democracy is a way to go, but sometimes in the long run that creates its own project, which I think in this particular case is a pity because it could have been a good economic project for Serbia. It could have been a good sort of a part of the solution for the EU green agenda, but it's become too toxic now, and sometimes not addressing these problems of cooperating with untrustworthy authoritarians creates bigger problems down the line.
Yeah, thank you, Marco. David, how do you see the EU's role in the Southern Caucasus?
Well, I actually don't want to repeat what Marco already said. I would say that the situation in the Caucasus is very different because EU really tries to combine these both goals and be strategic at the same time be non-driven. Well, on the other hand, we have to also acknowledge that it's not possible to achieve both goals simultaneously, and that it's not possible to be a global actor and always, let's say, act from this normative perspective. What we see in the Caucasus is that, yes, of course, in case of some countries in the region, EU prioritizes the stability, connectivity, energy flow, but while to other countries, let's say the democratic standards are higher. And as Marco said, in the case of Georgia, when these all objectives somehow overlapped, coincided, everything went smoothly, beginning in 2001, 2003. And then beyond that, the expectations were not as high as are today, right? I mean, nobody expected from Georgia to meet the membership requirements. And the level of democracy what Georgia showed back then was sufficient, would be recognized as sufficient. So, and other way around, the Georgian political elite was satisfied with the level of engagement or level of influence or demand what EU was putting in front of them. And while now these let's say tasks and the demands and expectations are raising, of course, that creates also the tension between these goals. However, again, I repeat, and probably when we come to the recommendation part, I think that still EU can do something to recalibrate, to change, adjust its policies. But I will stop now here.
Mm. Yeah, thank you very much. And we also don't have to forget that the European Union is also not the only external actor seeking to influence what's going on in these countries, but we have other global players that are very important for the entire region that we have investigated, right? Russia is a case in point in the eastern neighborhood. We have to consider the US role that has always played a substantial role both in the east and the southern neighborhood. With a hint to the time, very briefly, how have the geopolitical shifts that we have seen in the last 20 years influenced the chances for political change in the countries that you studied? David, what about Russia, for example, in the Southern Caucasus, and what role does it play?
Thank you, Sonia, for this question. Although our research was mostly it was focused on the let's say small gains and grassroots sectors. Of course, we all need to acknowledge the importance of this let's say macro events and the context is. But early 2000s were a completely different setting, right? I mean, there was still the time of this democratic zeitgeist. So it was the spirit everywhere. People still believed in the end of history that liberal democracy has no alternative, right? Then look at EU. I mean, EU was united, and also it was preparing for the next big bang type of extension, and the neighborhood policy was in development. Russia was not resurgent. It was still trying to accommodate the West, and rather than challenge it. And US, don't forget about US, it was still credible, let's say, the main actor or the leader of the free world. That's all gone today, right? I mean, and today we see that the completely different story is the reality, that idea of this rational authoritarianism being as a viable model for developing countries to solve their problems is very popular in many parts of the world. So therefore, it's completely different situation currently. And last but not least, the return of geopolitics, real politics, right? I mean, what we see with this war of Russia, not only in Russia, I mean, and we will go also to the southern flank of the EU, what's happening there. That's, of course, brings back to the table the very famous discussion about security versus democracy, security versus freedom, survival versus freedom discussion. And of course, when we project this to our level of analysis, the micro level, it's completely different and non-conclusive, different environment for small actors to survive. When we talk about this resilience of civil society, of course, to the civil society actors can withstand certain degree of pressure. But whenever these actors are confronted with overwhelming force, what's happening currently in Georgia, right? Cutting off these actors from resources, restricting through legal means, and subjected directly to repressions. And on top of this external situation, of course, many gains, what we have, let's say, documented archive back in beginning 2000s, it's completely out, and unfortunately, the situation does not look very promising.
Hmm. Yeah, thank you, David. So the return of geopolitics. Sarah, overviewing the entire MENA region, what does the return of geopolitics mean for this part of the neighborhood?
Well, I'll just focus on North Africa for the moment, but I think that, I think it actually has two different effects if we compare Tunisia and Algeria. I think given the geopolitical moment, given the situation in the Levant region, which I know Lara will talk about. I think for Tunisia, Tunisia is simply not on the list of priorities for most international actors at this point. I think for Europe, it is definitely not the priority. There's a certain degree of stability, and the Tunisian new president is doing the bidding of the EU in terms of stopping migration flows, which is the EU's priority. And I suspect that the US administration can't find Tunisia on a map, to be honest. So I don't think Tunisia is very important in that sense, which actually allows the regime to continue its practices and not face much resistance or pushback. The case of Algeria is quite different, though, the way geopolitics affects the Algerian political trajectory. Because of the war in Ukraine, this has obviously had a major impact on Europe's sense of energy security and energy autonomy. Algeria is a hydrocarbon producing country, has an enormous amount of natural resources, and this has pushed the EU to rethink its relationship with Algeria in terms of hydrocarbons. And the way the hydrocarbon industry is structured in Algeria, especially with the state-owned company, Sonatrach, which is a critical component of the Algerian regime's capacity to reproduce itself. It's a critical component of its political economy. The EU's rapprochement with Algeria over hydrocarbons to meet its own needs, the investments in the hydrocarbon industry, agreements on exploration, production, things like this. This actually contributes to a maintenance of the Algerian regime and actually a reinforcing of the Algerian regime and reinforcing of this political economy that has been so successful in kind of freezing the political situation in the country and allowing it to continue to reproduce itself through its patronage networks, its clientele networks. And so the way geopolitics is affecting, I would say in this case, is that it actually not only means the European Union is not going to put pressure on Algeria to make changes, but on the contrary, is actually going to be investing in the very structures that allow it to keep reproducing itself.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah, very much. In light of time, I would like to bring in a couple of questions that our listeners are posting to the chat. And the first one that I would like to raise is for Lara. I read it out loud. The international experiences show the limits of international pressure in the protection of local democratic movements. What alternative international tools are available to influence sorry, now it's moved. Where is it? To impact significantly during democratic crisis.
Sorry. Yes, thank you, Sonia. So in terms of the failure of pressure by the EU and other actors is insofar as the EU actually uses its leverage on Lebanon. So if leverage is used in a way that, in a more conditional way, the pressure could actually succeed in terms of, so for instance, making the assistance conditional upon some reforms on freedom of media, the judiciary, etc. So this can be used effectively. Other international tools could be supporting civil society and supporting the Lebanese on a technical level. So, for instance, supporting let's take the independence of the judiciary as a technical subject. or the reforming the electoral law, so supporting civil society organizations who work on that, is in itself would help leverage the or level the ground for competition between the political elite and other activists, and would bring them to the forefront of these discussions and perhaps make it more inclusive, these discussions. So technical support that actually lead to new faces and levels the ground on the long term could be one way. I have a lot more recommendations, but in the interest of time, I will just have this.
Yeah, we will come back to the recommendations at the end of this webinar. Marco, there is a question for you from the audience. It says, interesting what Marco said regarding effective democracy promotion by the EU only when aligned with economic and security interests. Would you say tension points could be seen in Turkey regarding migration? Do you think the Russian invasion of Ukraine has increased this gap between EU interests and democracy promotion and EU security interests?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. But I think another way of looking at it is that those developments have increased the maneuvering space for the authoritarian leaders in the Western Balkans, in Turkey, to sort of trade concessions on migration, on security in exchange for sort of lenience from the side of the EU on their way of ruling. And what I would say, I'm not sure, this might not apply to Turkey because it's a huge country, but Western Balkans, it's a collection of small, poor states with 15 million people, existing, living next to the single market of 500 million people, one of the richest in the world. So EU has so much leverage in the Western Balkans. It's an easy win, even in this sort of more geopolitically challenging and complex environment. But what I think this polycrisis, this return of geopolitics, whatever you want to call it, has done, it's made EU overly cautious, overly hesitant to use that leverage. And what I would like to see the EU being more ambitious, being more confident in its ability, at least in that region where it has so much leverage, to do all these things, to do the security, to do the geoeconomics, to control migration, and to support democracy. Because you cannot do it in your own backyard, then what else are we talking about? I think I don't want to have a tunnel vision because all these larger crises, I think a lot of them are more consequential than what happens with the Western Balkans, but in the grand scheme of things. But this would be a way for EU to show that it can still make a meaningful and positive change in its neighborhood because the region is so dependent. So if the EU wants to make a positive change, I think despite all these increasing complexities and risks, but it should see these moments of sort of mobilization, these moments of political change as an opportunity. And to do that, it needs to, as Sarah said, course correct more nimbly. And to do that, I think it needs to be a slightly higher priority for the political decision makers, rather than being relegated. I think the Western Balkans has often been relegated in the last decade to sort of bureaucracy. And bureaucracy, by the definition, doesn't have, it's not its remit to make those course changes, but the politicians do. And I think we're hearing some very good, optimistic changes, voices coming from the European Parliament. I think it's important to highlight that the EU is not a singular entity, and the European Parliament is seeing these opportunities, is talking about the collapse of democracy, and is trying to restore these value-based policies. And I'm hoping this translates into the way that the Commission and some key member states act as well.
Mm. Yeah, we have a lot more questions from the audience. I would like to take a third and a final one from the audience that somehow will also lead us nicely to an overall reflection. And it's addressed to Sarah. In how far has the EU learned in the context of support for civil society and social movements over time? So do you see that EU policymakers showed willingness to listen to social contestation, to local contestation, and critically reflect on its policies and really learn?
That's a great question. I mean, I will say on one hand, I don't think the research design we put into place necessarily allows us to fully answer that question, because we were looking at past examples of social mobilization. Some of them are actually quite historic examples, 20 years ago. So it's hard to say. I think as well the EU, and when we did the interviews, because we did interview the local delegations through this research, and they're very clear that that is not exactly their role, right? Their role is to support governments and to support institutions. And I don't think they necessarily see themselves as placed there to be helping social movement actors. They simply don't have the tools. That is not their role. And I don't think they see that as their role. So in that sense, I think they're interested in knowing, I think they would like to be seen as allies, would like to be seen as a source of support. But I don't think that there's necessarily a reflection on how the tools could be completely redesigned, what kinds of new tools would be necessary in order to lend that kind of support to these bottom-up actors, and in particular, actors that are not institutionalized, which is the case with many social movements. So I don't necessarily feel like there was that kind of critical reflection on policies or critical learning process. I think there was perhaps, especially in the case of Tunisia, with what else could the EU have, or what could the EU have done differently, perhaps at a critical moment. I mean, one of the main differences, and of course we knew this going into this project, between the southern region and the eastern region is that there's no possibility for membership into the EU. And so that giant carrot that the EU can use in certain cases simply does not apply. And I know, speaking with the delegation and with people from the community in the case of Tunisia, there was a feeling that because that was not on the table, there was only so much EU support was ever going to be able to do. And that there's perhaps a need to think of something that is maybe not quite full membership, but that is getting close to it, that would provide that carrot. So in that sense, and sort of the top-down sense, I think there was perhaps a certain degree of reflection.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sarah, for clarifying this. In light of time, and as we have promised to deliver also a couple of recommendations, I would like to ask you all for one key recommendation that you would like to share with the EU if you had a chance to tell the EU what lessons to be learned. What would that be? David, what is your key lessons for the EU?
Well, because of the limited time, directly to the point, I think the most important part is that you should reclaim this role of radiating this normative power and being really transformative. But it has to start within. I think that the problems what the EU has witnessed and dealing with democracy, decline in certain countries, liberal shrinking space, and so on and so far, that's something which damages the image of the European Union. Mm-hmm. The second moment is unity. That counts a lot, because especially in countries in our region, in countries that are neighboring the European Union, the credibility of the union matters. And whenever they see that there is no decisions made, and as Marco said, that there are lots of opportunities about this, there is no political will to use these opportunities, then of course it backfires. And when this credibility is restored, I'm pretty sure that will have also a tremendous effect on leverages. And then political elites will start again respecting the European Union. And that will then recreate this space for civil society, which we are now observing that is shrinking in the last decade.
Thank you, David. Marco, what would be your one key lessons to be learned for the EU?
Yes, very briefly. As I already said, I think David's comments also point in the direction. Be more confident, be more ambitious, be more nimble. That's it.
Thank you. That's really brief. Lara.
It's difficult to say in one word. I think the EU has a lot of allies in Lebanon, but I think one recommendation would be to realize that Lebanese can be allies of the EU in terms of the values and the democratic changes, etc., to a certain extent. When Lebanese people who are allied with the EU see that the European Union is having double standards, they see that their country is being bombed every single day, and the EU, including France, sits on the mechanism to monitor the ceasefire with Israel, but nothing is being done from the Israeli side, only on the Lebanese side. This really makes them lose their allies, but also makes them a not so credible actor. So I think the recommendation would be harness your allies, stick to your values, but also be consistent.
Mm. I think this is a very good advice. Be consistent. Sarah, what's your advice?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to build on what everyone said and actually kind of respond to Yazid's comments in the Q&A, which is that, in North Africa, the EU was always viewed with a high degree of skepticism. I mean, this was very clear in our interviews that the EU has double standards, that the EU is not actually particularly interested in democracy promotion or human rights protection in North Africa. And I have to say, I'd be remiss not saying it, the damage that has been done to the EU's reputation in the Arab region as a result of the genocide in Gaza cannot be overstated. It has done an immense amount of damage to the EU, and any ability it has to push for influence or even find, even with the most human rights promoting actors in the region, to find any form of alliances. So given this situation, what the EU could do in places like Tunisia and North Africa is push back against all of the arbitrary detentions, arrests, the vast repressive mechanisms that are being put into place against opposition actors, and against anyone who dares speak up or even spoke up 5-10 years ago and wrote a tweet that the government has now found. So at least doing that would at least partially contribute to demonstrating that they actually are a normative actor.
So I think this is a very important key message that we want to signal. If the EU wants to be a normative actor, it should really stick to that and be a consistent normative actor. So I think this is a message that we would like to clearly channel. Within an hour, one can only scratch the surface of a 3 years project with so much empirical insights that we have collected. And I would like to thank my colleagues here in the webinar very much for sharing these insights with us, and also the entire listeners, the audience that have put so many very important questions into the chat. And we are very sorry that we could only respond to a few of them, but we are happy to continue the conversation. And I'm very happy also to having done this great project together with my dear colleagues at Berghof. So Vero, you are the person who are giving the farewell now to all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you to all of you. What an exciting and thought-provoking conversation. And thank you so much indeed to the audience for joining us today. And we wish we had time to answer more of the questions. Oh my God, an hour goes much too fast. And thanks for your patience with allowing a few more minutes of our time. So yes, the Embrace project is coming to a close after 3 years of collaborative research. And we are proud to share a lot of findings that we hope will be of use to both policy makers and practitioners. So I invite all of you listeners to explore our website. We have a lot of scientific and policy publications. We have a podcast series. We have a digital platform for activists. We have a mapping tool, and we have soon also an open access book. So on behalf of the Embrace Consortium, thank you again for your interest, your questions, and your commitment. So stay connected to our work, and let's continue the conversation beyond today. So take care, and we hope to see you all again soon. Bye-bye.